You are listening to We Saw the Devil, an investigative and conversational true crime podcast that deep dives into fascinating criminal cases that are solved, unsolved, or ongoing. From America's Lori Vallow to Germany's Armin Meiwes, we examine and discuss the world's most shocking cases. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow us online. Check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com and We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, you can become part of the show by backing us on Patreon. Hello everyone, you are listening to We Saw the Devil. I'm your host Robin, and this is part 2 of Let the World See the Death of Emmett Till. If you haven't listened to part 1, please stop this episode right now, go back, and start there. This is a monumental event in United States history. It helped ignite the civil rights movement, and quite honestly, it's one of the biggest stains in our history. And I also think the full story is important. So if you haven't listened to it, please just stop here and then go check out the previous episode. It's about 30 minutes long. But before we continue with the story, let's just get our really quick housekeeping out of the way. You're listening to We Saw the Devil. Our website is WeSawTheDevil.com. From there, you can find all of our socials, send an email, join our Patreon, and buy some merch. Most importantly, if you're enjoying this content, please take 20 seconds to leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to. It means the absolute world to me and helps in more ways than you know. Now that that's out of the way, let's continue the story of Emmett Till. Part 1 ended 3 days after the whistling incident at Bryant's grocery and meat market. 14-year-old Emmett Till had spent a whole day picking cotton with his family and decided to go to the local market to buy some bubble gum. After he paid his 10 cents, he went outside and joined his friends. Carolyn Bryant, the co-owner and clerk, left the store and began to walk towards her car. Emmett Till whistled at her. What followed was 3 days of paranoia for the black teenagers, as Carolyn Bryant had been telling all of the white townspeople about the boy from Chicago who had whistled at her. Not only that, though, but she decided to enhance her story. She began to tell people that he tried to grab her, put his hand around her waist, asked her out on a date, and told her that he had slept with, quote, plenty of white women. Word of Emmett's supposed behavior circulated around the town like a wildfire, and the story made it back to the black community. Family and friends of Mose Wright came to him and begged him to get Emmett on a train back to Chicago. On August 28th, at 2:30 a.m., 15-year-old Wheeler Parker, Emmett Till's cousin, who was also staying with Mose Wright, was sleeping in a small bedroom with another cousin, Maurice. He heard a loud car engine approach the house, pull into the dirt driveway, and then turn off. Then silence. Then angry male voices and shouting. The men were talking loudly and angrily, and Wheeler heard the phrases, "Take us to the N-word, who did the talking," and also, "that fat boy from Chicago." In that moment, Wheeler's blood turned cold and he knew what was happening. He kept his eyes shut as he heard heavy work boots walk through the small wooden house and stop in front of his bedroom door. The doorknob turned, and then the light from a flashlight rested on his face. Wheeler opened his eyes and saw Roy Bryant, Carolyn Bryant's husband, staring back down at him. Beside him was J.W. Milam, one of Roy's friends. He was holding a .45 caliber pistol in his hand. Realizing that neither Wheeler nor Maurice was the boy that they were looking for, they snarled at them to go back to sleep, told them to keep their eyes closed, turned around, and left. Wheeler listened as they walked across the house to the room where Emmett and Simeon were sleeping. His only hope was that Emmett would capitulate to the white men and not aggravate the situation. Hopefully, he thought, Emmett's beating wouldn't be that bad. Maybe they would torture him a little bit and then drop him back off. Simeon Wright, who was sleeping next to Emmett, was the first to wake up. He heard the doorknob turn and the sounds of heavy footsteps walk into the room. Opening his eyes, he immediately recognized Roy Bryant. Beside him was a man holding a gun. They told him to close his eyes and go back to sleep. He kept his eyes open. Emmett Till, jarred awake by the interaction, had no idea what was happening. The white men immediately began to interrogate him and ask him questions. Half asleep, he answered their questions without saying, "Yes, sir," or "No, sir." This enraged Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, and they began to curse and yell at Emmett and call him racial slurs. They told Emmett that he was going to leave with them, and J.W. Milam pointed his pistol at the 14-year-old boy. Emmett tried to put his socks on, and the men wouldn't even allow it. Mose Wright and his wife Elizabeth were begging, crying, and pleading with Roy and J.W. Milam not to take Emmett. They even offered to pay them money to leave him alone. As they walked out of the door with Emmett, J.W. Milam turned around, looked at Mose, and asked how old he was. Perplexed, Mose replied, 64. J.W. Milam said, "If you tell anyone about this, you won't live until 65. As Wheeler Parker would later say in an interview, Emmett Till had no idea what the reality of his situation was. He had no possible ability to conceive the level of hatred against Black people in the rural South. Milam and Bryant marched Emmett Till to their car. Another cousin who was sleeping inside the house heard a voice say, "This him?" A female voice replied, "Yeah." The car engine started up and it sped down the road away from Mose Wright's home, and the night fell silent. I'm going to play an audio clip right now. It's the original recording of Mose Wright, Emmett Till's great uncle, explaining in his own words what happened that night.
This is Mose Wright. I am the uncle of Emmett Louis Till. Sunday morning, about 2:30, someone called at the door. And I said, "Who is it?" And he said, "This is Mr. Bryant. I want to talk with you and the boy." And when I opened the door, there was a man standing with a pistol in one hand and a flashlight in the other hand. And he asked me, did I have two boys there from Chicago? I told him I have. And he said, I want the boy that done all that talk. They marched him to the car, and they asked someone there, was this is the right boy? And the answer was, here. And they drove toward money.
After Milam and Bryant left with Emmett, no one in the house said a word. They laid in their beds, eyes on the ceiling, waiting to hear the same car engine pull into the driveway. Mose Wright paced and walked the floor until sunrise. Still, no sign of Emmett. A couple hours later, across town, after the sun had finally risen, 18-year-old Willie Reed Green was asked by his grandfather to go pick up some groceries at Little Bishop's store and money. He took off for the mile-and-a-half walk into town, and as he was walking, a 1955 Chevrolet truck flew by. Willie saw 4 white men in the cab, and then 3 black men in the back bed, plus young Emmett Till. Willie had never met Emmett Till, but based on the look on his face, he got an unsettling, sinking feeling in his stomach. As Willie Green walked further down the road, he saw the truck parked at a small seed barn at the Milam plantation, which was managed by J.W. Milam's half-brother, Leslie Milam. As he got closer, he heard beating and screaming and then muffled cries. He heard slaps and punches, more cries and grunts. He went to Miss Manny's house. She was a neighbor to the Milam plantation. He asked her if she'd heard anything or knew anything about what was happening. He told her that someone was being brutally beaten in the barn. She did not know anything, but said they should walk closer to investigate. The two began to walk to the edge of her property, which was directly across from that seed barn. There was a water well there, and Willie used it as a guide so that he could be closer. At that point, though, they heard nothing. There was silence. Seconds later, J.W. Milam emerged from the seed barn and began to walk directly over to Willie and Miss Manny. Wearing a green shirt, khaki pants, with his .45 caliber pistol strapped to his belt, he asked Willie, "Did you hear anything?" Willie replied, "No, I ain't heard nothing." He and Miss Manny went back to her house, and then he departed, continuing his trip to the grocery store. Later that evening, Mary Johnson and her family, neighbors of J.W. Milam's actual home, saw a fire burning in a barrel in the back of his property. Word began to spread around town that Emmett Till had been kidnapped by Bryant and Milam. On August 29th, Carolyn Bryant's husband, Roy Bryant, as well as J.W. Milam, were arrested on kidnapping charges in connection with Emmett Till's disappearance. They were jailed and held without bond in Greenwood, Mississippi in Leflore County. Here is the original article in a Greenwood newspaper from August 29th announcing the arrest. And disclaimer, there is a racial slur in this article. It reads, "Here in Greenwood, Mississippi, 2 white men charged with kidnapping a 15-year-old Chicago Negro because they claimed he insulted the wife of one of the men, claim today they released the missing boy unharmed. Sheriff George Smith said Roy Bryant, a storekeeper in nearby Money Community, and his half-brother J.W. Milam were held on kidnapping charges in the mysterious disappearance of Emmett Till of Chicago. They were arrested yesterday." Smith said Till's whereabouts was the $64 question. Smith said he planned to question Bryant's wife, allegedly insulted by Till in Bryant's small store Saturday. He said there was nothing new to indicate where the boy might be. It was possible that relatives of Till were hiding him out of fear for the youth's safety, Smith said, or had sent him back to Chicago. He said he couldn't say if the boy had been harmed. The Bryants were said to have become offended when young Till waved to the woman and said goodbye when he left the store. Witnesses said Mrs. Bryant identified the boy as the one. The group then drove away with him. Smith said Bryant and Milam claimed that later they found out that he was not the one who allegedly insulted Mrs. Bryant and that Till was then released. Several Negro youths, all under 16, were reported to have been with Till in the store and were said to have forced him to leave the store for being rowdy. End of article. And that wasn't the only newspaper to pick up on the story. Not only had word traveled fast around Mississippi, but Mamie Till had been working hard in Chicago, calling multiple chapters of the NAACP, as well as sending a telegraph directly to the White House. Medgar Evers, the Mississippi State Field Secretary for the NAACP, also got involved. He and Amzie Moore, the head of the Bolivar County NAACP, actually went so far to disguise themselves as hired cotton pickers and went out into the cotton fields to talk to local sharecroppers, attempting to get any information that they could. When Till originally went missing, a 3-paragraph article was published in the Greenwood Commonwealth. They then followed that up with the arrest of Milam and Bryant, and also eventually with the discovery of his body. The famous portrait of Emmett Till and his mother smiling, the one in which he's wearing his brand new Christmas suit, was published in the Jackson Daily News and Vicksburg Evening Post. And then the letters to the editor came pouring in. Hundreds of letters, mostly from readers overwhelmingly disturbed, embarrassed, and ashamed of Till's death. One infamous letter read, quote, "Now is the time for every citizen who loves the state of Mississippi to stand up and be counted before hoodlum white trash brings us to destruction." It went on to basically say that Black people weren't at fault for the downfall of Mississippi society. It was the bigoted and hateful white people who were. Even across the Atlantic Ocean, in Belgium and Central Europe, the newspaper Le Drapeau Rouge published a story entitled "Racism in the USA. A Young Black is Lynched in Mississippi." Stories also followed in France and Germany. On August 31st, 3 days after Emmett Till was kidnapped from his great-uncle's home, a young boy who was fishing in the Tallahatchie River discovered a body. Police were called to recover it. When they first attempted to lift the remains out of the water, 6 square inches of the skull fell from the crown of the head. Between being in the water and the heinous torture that the body had clearly endured, it was completely unrecognizable and unidentifiable. The body had been weighted down by a 75-pound cotton gin fan attached to the neck by barbed wire. Mose Wright was called to identify the body. The smell was overwhelming. He was able to identify his great-nephew as soon as he saw the ring with the initials LT. Lewis Till, Emmett Till's father.
The sheriff came and told me they had found the body at Phillip and wanted me to go and identify the body, which I did. And we found the body with didn't have on any clothes at all. The body was so badly damaged that we couldn't hardly just tell who he was, but he happened to have on a ring with his initials, and that cleared it up.
The body was in fact Emmett Till. Mamie Till, knowing that Emmett had been kidnapped and was still missing, finally received the call that made her worst fears come true. Her Bobo, her sweet and loving boy, was dead. She ran to her mother's house, who made her coffee. Family and close friends descended upon Alma's home to offer their support and condolences. People were wailing, crying, and falling to their knees when they entered through the door. But there was work to be done. Simultaneously, down in Mississippi, Sheriff Clarence Strider was also hard at work. Emmett Till's body had just been identified by Mose Wright when Sheriff Strider demanded that Wright and Emmett's other local family members there in Mississippi get his body buried before nightfall. He then threatened them. Even the sheriff knew that it wouldn't be good news if the rest of the country, or even the world, saw what happened to Emmett Till. And more about Sheriff Clarence Strider. He was a short, wealthy white man who weighed almost 300 pounds. He owned a local plantation that had been in his family for more than 100 years, and he was known for being as racist and hateful as they come, arresting and harassing black citizens nearly any time the chance would arise. He had hundreds of black sharecroppers working for him who owned their own homes, and he required that they paint Strider, his last name, on the roofs of all of their shacks. He would laugh to friends and say that he owned them and was single-handedly keeping slavery alive in Mississippi. Sheriff Strider would also go on to become an infamous and offensive figure in the upcoming trial. Mose Wright called Mamie and let her know that they were having a funeral. Emmett was then prepared for burial. He was clothed and placed into a simple pine coffin and taken to a small country graveyard where Sheriff Strider already had a plot dug with Emmett's name on it. Then the funeral began. Except Mamie Till was not going to allow it, even if she was almost 700 miles away in Chicago. She had called congressmen and newspapers, lawyers, and representatives from the NAACP. Mamie raced against the clock to persuade officials to return her son to Chicago. It cost her $3,300, which equates to roughly $34,000 today. Even though Mamie was making less than $4,000 a year, she begged and pleaded with the local funeral home director in Chicago for a loan. She said that if she lived, she would pay him back. If she were to die, her family would ensure that it got paid. He gave her that loan, and Emmett's body was transferred back to Chicago. The following day, on September 1st, Mississippi Governor Hugh White called for local officials to fully prosecute Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. But don't get too excited about that. Hugh White was an incredible racist in his own right. He was a racist mayor and then became a racist governor. In the 1948 Democratic National Convention, Hugh White and some delegates from Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana all walked out of the entire convention center because Hubert Humphrey, the mayor of Minneapolis at the time, gave a speech where he dared to tell attendees that their party needed to, quote, get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. Merely being told, hey, maybe the South shouldn't own and maybe discriminate against black people, triggered these people so badly that they left the convention entirely. In the 1950s, it was becoming very clear via the federal courts that the separate but equal doctrine was going to be found unconstitutional, thus eventually desegregating public schools. Hugh White got busy forming a strategy for Mississippi. He started with the budget, giving incredible amounts of money to help both rural and urban black schools and black communities. He even proposed legislation that would match black teacher salaries to those of white teachers. Proud of himself, he called upon more than 100 black leaders from all around Mississippi and gave them his proposal. They rejected it. Why? Because all Hugh White was trying to do was ensure that the state remained segregated. Why would black students need to integrate if they had nice schools themselves? The black community rejected his offer. On September 2nd, Emmett's casket arrived in Chicago at the Illinois Central Terminal. Mamie Till arrived to pick it up in an absolute flurry of photographers and journalists. The most famous picture from this case is a picture of Mamie collapsing in grief the moment she first saw Emmett's casket. The casket was taken to the A.A. Rayner and Sons funeral home, where Mamie Till discovered that the casket was nailed shut. Perplexed and wanting to see her son's body, she asked the funeral director, Mr. Rayner, if he had a hammer. He told Mamie to go home and that if she was that determined, he would do it for her. He'd just call her to let her know when it was open. He called her a few hours later, and Mamie returned to the funeral home with her family. As she got to roughly 3 blocks away from the funeral home, she smelled a horrible smell. It got stronger with each block she got closer, and as she made it to the funeral home, the smell of death and decomposition was overwhelming. Mamie began to approach Emmett's casket, but her male family members held her back. She shrugged them off and approached her child's body. In an interview with PBS, Mamie Till described exactly what she saw. She said, "I saw his tongue had been choked out and was lying on his chin. I saw that his right eye was out and lying about midway to the cheek. I looked at his left eye, and it was completely gone. I looked at the bridge of his nose, and it looked like someone took a meat chopper to it. I looked at his teeth because I took so much pride in his teeth. They were the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. He had 2 now. Where were the rest of them? They had been knocked out. And then I was looking at his ears, except I couldn't find them. Where were his ears? And that's when I discovered the hole. A bullet hole in which I could look through and see daylight on the other side. Why did they have to shoot him? And I also discovered that they had taken an axe and gone straight down across his head. His face and the back of his head were separate. Emmett Till's genitals had also been severed." The moments following this, a culmination of grief, anger, disgust, sadness, and fear. Mr. Rayner, the funeral director, asked Mamie if she wanted an open casket funeral. Mamie replied, "Let the people see what I see. I want the world to see what happened to my baby, because there's no way I can tell this story and give them the visual picture of what my son looked like." And so they did. The following day, on September 3rd, 1955, Emmett Till's body was taken to Chicago's Roberts Temple Church of God for a viewing. The casket was open. Tens of thousands of people waited in line to see Emmett's mutilated body, and among them, a great deal of press. Photographs of Emmett Till's open casket circulated in newspapers and magazines all over the country, particularly in Black publications. Unfortunately, history repeats itself. And if the state of Mississippi had previously felt shame and remorse for the murder of Emmett Till, that seemed to have passed after those first few days of September. Mississippi newspapers were inundated with pictures of Roy Bryant, J.W. Milam, and Carolyn Bryant, all beautiful, smiling pictures. Roy and J.W. in their military uniforms, looking like good, patriotic Americans. Carolyn Bryant's beauty was discussed at length in lieu of actual news pieces. False news stories were planted by those sympathetic to Bryant and Milam, claiming that white Mississippians were in danger of falling victim to a violent Black uprising. The Ku Klux Klan was retaliating by burning crosses in the yards of some Black townspeople. Sheriff Clarence Strider, who was the first on the scene, assisted in identifying Emmett Till's body and then attempted to force his family to immediately bury him, was now claiming that he had doubts that the body was Emmett Till. He said it had to have been a random corpse planted in the river by T.R.M. Howard, a local Black businessman and leader of the NAACP. Why would he do this? According to Sheriff Strider, in order to get sympathy for Black people and then also start a race war. Because so many members of the press had descended upon Greenwood, Mississippi, there was a complete switch away from the sympathetic, angry, and ashamed tone that had previously been seen in the public sphere. Many residents blamed the Northerners and the media for coming down and sowing seeds of chaos in the rural South. Obviously, none of that was true. It's estimated that more than 100,000 people viewed Emmett Till's body, and when he was buried 3 days later, on September 6th, at Burr Oak Cemetery, thousands more came to pay their respects. On the same day, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were indicted by a grand jury for the kidnapping and murder of Emmett Till. They both pled not guilty and were held without bond, jailed until the start of the trial. The trial was scheduled for a couple weeks later, on September 19th. On September 15th, Jet magazine published pictures, not only of Emmett Till's mutilated body, but also of Mamie crying draped over his casket. Because the magazine was a national publication, It shared the story with Black readers all over the country from coast to coast, north to south. And this is where we are going to stop in this episode. Part 3 is going to cover the trial, as well as the aftermath, where all of these people are now, what happened to them, as well as why the Emmett Till story has resurfaced and has been in the news for the last couple weeks. You can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com. From there, you can find us across all socials, join our Patreon, buy merch, and send us an email. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Until next crime.